So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our next two speakers, which are really testing the virtual element of this event to its max. Firstly, we have virtually joining us is Ian Stewart, our global economist. Hello, Ian. And he will be joined after he's led us through the economic trends by our UK and North-Southern Europe CEO, Richard Houston. So, I'm going to hand over to you, Ian.
Great. Thanks very much, Candice. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there, but this wonderful technology is a very good substitute. So, look, the idea of this session is that I'm going to offer some ideas as an economist about how technology affects the economy, and then I'm going to discuss it, debate it with our chief exec, Richard Houston, who's actually on the sharp end of this. And I guess my starting point is that, you know, in the long term, it is technology and its ideas which drive human progress. I mean, it's a really big idea, but it is true. It is the way in which we deploy technology and ideas in the workplace which enables us to increase the efficiency of production and raise GDP, but much more importantly, incomes and human welfare. And the standstill in productivity that we've had in the West in the last sort of 12 years, I think goes a long way to explain quite a lot of the discontent, the sort of political discontent that we've seen. The system has become less effective at delivering higher levels of prosperity. Well, you know, the question is, you know, what can we learn from history about this? And I guess the sort of history of the period since the Industrial Revolution is that when you apply ideas and technology in the productive process, you can get explosive growth rates. And something seems to have gone wrong in that process, particularly in the United Kingdom since the financial crisis. Productivity growth has almost ground to a halt. And this is a real paradox, because I think that in our own lives, we're seeing technology having tremendous transformational effects. But, you know, as an economist, I'm looking at the numbers and I'm thinking, well, what's going on? Why aren't these technologies actually impacting the efficiency of production? Now, I think now could be a really interesting moment for productivity, because we've got a combination of factors. The tremendous change, the organizational change, which has been driven by the pandemic, coupled with an enforced application of technology across economies. So, you know, the rise of contactless payments, the forced move to remote working, you know, dramatic change in how we use technology. Actually, investment in technology has actually risen during one of the deepest recessions we've seen globally since the 1930s. Very unusual, but a positive sign. And at the same time, there are shortages of labor, there are constraints on supply, which give companies an incentive to try to drive productivity. And the final thing is that we are in the early phases of an industrial revolution, which is going to see a complete change in what fuels we use and how we use them in economies. And we know from history that big energy transitions tend to be good for productivity. So that's the theory, that's the backdrop. As an economist, I'm feeling rather more optimistic about technology and its application in the workforce, its ability to move the dial. But what I'd like to do now, in conversation with Richard, is just test that against his experience as our CEO. So I think Richard is now coming up on stage.
Hello, Ian. Can you hear me?
Hello, Richard. I can't see you. I can see two of me and I can't see you, but that's fine.
Well, I can definitely assure everybody that times are changing, because it comes to something when your chief economist is in Monaco and your CEO is on stage here at Farnborough. So, Ian, where are we going with this conversation?
Oh dear, Richard, you've dropped me in it. So look, here's a tough question. I talk about productivity. Economists are obsessed with productivity. I just wonder, do businesses think in terms of productivity as a way of measuring how their investment in technology is improving the operation of the business? I mean, I sometimes wonder whether there's a bit of a sort of, economists talk productivity, business thinks about other things. What are your thoughts on that in terms of sort of balance sheet metrics that corporates look at?
Well, if you look at productivity as a metric and what we would use, I mean, clearly gross margin's important, and for us as a people business, then we obviously look at revenue per professional in terms of a productivity measure. But one of the things that we see that is changing dramatically in line with a post-COVID world is thinking about talent. And you mentioned about shortages of talent and what that means. And therefore, it's not just about productivity. One of the things that we're seeing, and I suspect many organizations are seeing, is the typical cyclical nature of business around when people are available, what they're doing is changing quite dramatically. And actually, the typical nature we have of a holiday profile for an organization is changing. And therefore, some of the things that we're starting to look at as more predictive measures is things like holidays. It's also about health, well-being, sickness, all these things. And in a post-COVID world where we have a very hybrid model, which we're obviously experiencing today, what we are also going to be looking at is that connectivity for individuals. So when will individuals be coming back into the office? Now, you'll know, Ian, we've taken a step in our own organisation to give people the choice as to when they come in. But at the same time, for those people that aren't in the office on a regular basis, how do we ensure we look after their own health and well-being, and we get some indication as to how they're feeling connected to an organisation? So I think traditional measures of productivity are going to change quite dramatically. And for us, as a people-centric organisation, there's a lot of different things that we're going to need to be looking at alongside some of the traditional measures that you talked about.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that in an economy where human capital is so important that actually maybe we should be thinking about the kind of inputs in terms of people's well-being and holidays and so on, as much as trying to measure the actual productivity. I mean, you Richard, have had to navigate our business through an unimaginable downturn, something which breaks the record books. And you were, I think, running our consulting business during the financial crisis 12 years ago. Now, I mean, one of the things that struck me is that businesses have responded extraordinarily quickly and flexibly to the downturn. One of the things I'm slightly surprised about is that although we have supply disruptions, given the mayhem we have seen in terms of growth, you could argue that we haven't done badly in terms of inflation and disruptions. These are things that could never weren't in any kind of models. But I just wonder, thinking of your experience, Richard, through the pandemic, comparing it with the financial crisis, is there how would you characterize the response of the corporate sector? And is there anything that surprised you about how corporates have managed through this epic crisis?
Look, you'll know, Ian, that I took on the role some 9 months before March 2020. So I sort of found myself in the middle of the pandemic without a rule book. And one of the things that was very clear to me is that actually this wasn't like a financial crisis. If you look back to the financial crisis, there was a recognition and acceptance that a lot of the response would be government-led and that there would be an institutional response to the crisis, and business was some way waiting. What was clear in this instance is that business couldn't wait. actually. There was a whole series of things that we needed to take decisions now. And that sort of speed and agility that you talked about was absolutely critical. And therefore, actually, things like adoption of technology was absolutely essential. And if you look at what sort of happened, in reality, we, like many organizations, had various forms of connection. And we had our own VPN network, but we certainly didn't have capacity for 55,000 people on it. And we also had various different technologies for connecting and communicating with individuals. None of them had ever been tested at scale. So I think what we saw was a degree of response, but the challenge was in the scaling to actually operating everybody remotely. All of us had some degree of remote working. In our own firm, probably 10 to 15% were working remotely on a regular basis. And in a week, we moved the entire organization to working remotely. And I admit that I had a few sleepless nights that week. But what is remarkable is the resilience of business. And therefore, it felt to me that this was very much driving the response in a way this time that was very different to the 2008. And if there was anything that surprised me, it was the fact that business was able to respond so quickly. Now, you could argue it was out of necessity and need, but interestingly, it was a very different sort of response we've typically seen.
Yeah, and I think that, economists and policymakers were surprised at the speed of the recovery in the global economy. And of course, that partly reflects just the enormous response in terms of fiscal and monetary ease. But I think you're absolutely right that it also reflects the fact that we had networks and systems, particularly in terms of technology, which just didn't exist 20 years ago, which enabled the business sector to flex in a way which I think was really remarkable. And I was struck that in the space of about 10 days, across the UK, we went from about 5% of the working population working remotely to about half. I mean, it's astonishing. Had we been given time to plan it, we probably would have required about five years. I guess something that we've wrestled with is the question of innovation and who does innovation belong to. And I think in the sort of popular narrative that we think of the Amazons and the Alphabets as being the great innovators, but do you think that innovation is principally about the latest technology, or is there much more to it than that?
Well, quite simply, I think there is a lot more to it than that. I mean, interestingly, in our own government's response to the crisis, and if you think about how people, and particularly local GPs, for example, were communicating, they were using the telephone. And why were they using the telephone? Because the demographic of the people they were trying to get hold of was actually very much telephone-based. So I don't think it's all about the tech per se. I do think that that technology is important, and technology clearly drives the degree of innovation that organizations are able to achieve. And interestingly for me, it's not just about the tech, it's about the outcomes that you can achieve with the tech. And sometimes there's unforeseen consequences, good ones, actually. So I'll take an example. Recently, and they were saying they had innovated in their business to be able to respond to building regulations by being able to digitally supply an evidence as they went through the build process, rather than necessarily having an inspector come along and have a look. And interestingly, they saw two unforeseen consequences. One is that their employee engagement went up because they felt that they were being invested in as individuals to support the development of the business. And secondly, they actually had a lower turnover of people, as you might imagine, with the two things being connected. So, interestingly, technology, I feel, is one component of innovation, but it's what you can do with it rather than owning technology in its own right.
Yeah, and that certainly seems to fit with the evidence of previous waves of technology, that what seems to really move the dial on productivity is mass deployment in the workplace. And so the reorganization which happens around new technologies is the key to unlocking the productivity. So that the people and the organizational side, without that, you can't realize the gains from these technologies. I suppose, if we think about innovation, and I suppose the word may change over time, but businesses have thought about innovation for a very, very long time. I mean, do you think business is getting better at innovation? Is it finding new ways to innovate? And are there any sort of perspectives from Deloitte, any observations from things that you've worked on or been involved with at Deloitte in how we've done innovation, which you think might have wider application?
Well, interestingly, yeah, I do think businesses are getting better at innovation. But if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I might have said the pace of change was slow. But I think one of the things that the pandemic has proven is that ability to innovate at pace. And for our own organisation, it's been very much the same as a number of others. But I think there are three things that innovation drives and you need in an organisation. Interestingly, we talked a little bit in the previous discussion around technology as one component. I think culture is really important in an organisation. I think you can't have an organisation that is trying to be innovative if you have an overly risk-averse and a permission-based culture. I think you have to have and create an environment that actually people feel able to, rewarded and recognised for innovating. And therefore, I think culture is really important. The second thing I think, and our own organisation is no different to many others, is you don't have to innovate on your own. I think alliances, partnerships, or working with organisations in collaboration are an integral part of most organisations' modern thinking about how they innovate, be it to drive growth, be it to improve customer service, and looking for those opportunities. And you'll have seen our own organisation announcing a partnership with Vodafone around health tech, and bringing the best of what Vodafone can offer alongside with the boast of what Deloitte can offer together to improve health quality and health service. And therefore, I don't feel that you need to innovate on your own. And that alliance's second point, alongside culture, is really important. And the last point is, don't forget the impact on skills and the skills that you need in an organisation. And creating a different sorts of organisation and ending in a different position often requires different sets of skills. And quite often we talk about skills that are lost, but also quite often it's about skills that can be gained. And I think business has an obligation to help and support society more broadly around skills. And you'll know that we are also very much focused on skills and how we can support the third sector, for example, our charity and social partners build their digital capability and skills to enable them to effectively respond to what is now a very, very different and quite challenging environment for them to actually raise funds. So I would say, yes, organisations are innovating more quickly. And yes, that's driven through necessity, particularly over the last 2 years. But I think the combination of culture, alliances and partnerships, and thinking through the implications of skills are three of the areas that are an integral part of how you build a more innovative organisation.
And I suppose, thinking about a challenge which goes so far beyond business, but is an existential challenge, the climate change. And we know there are costs and there's going to be a lot of regulation coming. I just wonder if you could share, your thoughts on how Deloitte is approaching climate and the extent to which, you think that it's going to be a driver of the kind of creative destruction that economists talk about, in which you see change, which unleashes productivity gains and efficiency gains. So just, the views on climate, Richard.
And I can't think of a single time anybody has been on stage anywhere and we haven't touched on this topic. And it's quite interesting. You talk to anybody at the moment, you wind the clock back 2 years, and pre-COVID, it felt to me that climate, sustainability and a broader purpose agenda was an adjacency to business. I think you look in a post-COVID world, these things are inherently at the core of business, and business has a responsibility. And, to bring that to life, you'll know our own CFO survey, Ian, that we do every quarter, that you're the architect for, has said that, our CFOs, the primary driver of sustainability and changes to move to a net zero based business are driven by customers. Now, interestingly, I would agree. And why would I agree? Just in the last 6 weeks, I've heard from 5 or 6 of our major customers asking us as a supplier, what are we doing around our own commitments to net zero, and more, how are we evidencing that? How are we evidencing our own commitments? And therefore, from a climate and sustainability perspective, being able to evidence that to your customers is really important. The second reason why I think it's supremely important is actually, and I'm sure many people here in the audience, our people are asking. If you looked at our own millennials survey, over 85% of those individuals would say that climate and sustainability is their number one priority for a business. And therefore, if you look as an employer in the current challenges that we see around attracting and retaining the best possible talent in the market, alongside it being appropriate for us to support our customers, I think we absolutely have to make that commitment to deliver to our own people. And if we don't, I think we'll struggle. And as a people business, to attract and retain the best people, that moving the purpose and that sense of purpose to the heart of our business is really, really important. And therefore, I think that whereas an adjacency perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, an important issue, but it wasn't at the heart of business, I think it's absolutely at the heart of business. And any business that's thinking at the moment about the direction of travel and strategy, you will see that their own commitments to becoming a net zero business is hugely at the heart of that.
Yeah, and in the work we've done with CFOs, it does climate emerges as an absolutely pervasive risk and a balance sheet risk. So a long way from the notion of just of ESG, this is something that affecting the cost of capital, asset prices, the ability to build revenues. I mean, a really, really big change. Well, I think we've got time for one final question. I think this is probably the really hard one, actually. I mean, Deloitte has been through remarkable change, I suppose, like all organisations in the last 20 months or so. And I guess the question would be, what is the one piece of advice that you would share as our CEO navigating our business through the pandemic? What is the one piece of advice you would offer to business leaders contemplating transformation in their own businesses?
Wow, one piece of advice, Ian. Okay, so look, aside from all the criticality of ensuring you have the right delivery capability and planning and all the right good things, the one piece of advice I would say is know your stakeholders. Ensure you prioritize the messaging around your transformation journey for those stakeholders and personalize it, and make sure you commit enough time, energy, investment, and personal commitment to delivering those messages and engaging. Because frankly, I've seen some fabulous transformations that have done amazing things, but the stakeholders didn't realize. I've seen some amazing transformations that are almost at the reverse end, where they've managed their stakeholders super well and haven't probably achieved everything. But they had a happy organization. Now, clearly, there's a balance in between. But I think the importance of ensuring that you understand who those stakeholders are, and they'll be broad and range, internal and external, could be investors, could be regulators, could be government, could be your own people, and therefore ensuring you understand who they are, what they're looking for, and managing that message and that stakeholder management through the process. Now, you know I work in a partnership, so it's fabulous. I have all 3,000 of my own investors in my own organization, and they all expect to be a part of the journey and to critique it and offer me advice. Now, clearly, that's not necessarily the same for all organizations, but managing those stakeholders, understanding that, and bringing them on the journey with you as part of that transformation, to my mind, is the one critical thing that can help ensure that you'll have a successful transformation.
Richard, thanks for that. I mean, actually, in this conversation, I think what comes over to me as an economist is how we need to set innovation and productivity growth and the deployment of technology in the culture of organizations, and the importance of skills, of course, of people, and communication in turning the kind of potential in inventions and technology into reality. And that seems to be as much a challenge as the pure question of invention. So I think we are now timed out. I'm just delighted that the technology has lasted this long. So Richard, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And next year, I'm going to be in Monaco and he's going to be here.